Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt of the yard, the dust rising in 2 sad puffs that seemed to mock the finality of the gesture. Her son, Leo, a small, silent shadow of a boy not yet 6, clung to the worn fabric of her skirt, his knuckles white. Before them, the Thorn Ranch sprawled under the vast, unforgiving Montana sky. It was not a picture of prosperity. The main house, a 2-story log structure that might once have been handsome, now wore a weary coat of faded paint and neglect. Fences sagged in places, and the barn door hung from a single groaning hinge. It was a place teetering on the edge, much like herself. Cora took a breath, the air thin and sharp with the scent of pine and dry earth. She had walked the last 5 miles from the stagecoach drop, her last dollar spent on the ticket that brought her this far and no farther. This was it, the end of the line. A man emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that seemed to have more grease on it than the part he was cleaning. He was tall, but stooped, as if carrying a weight far heavier than his own frame. His face was a road map of harsh sun and long years, his eyes the gray of creek stones after a hard rain. He stopped when he saw them, his expression a mixture of surprise and profound weariness. This had to be him. Elias Thorne. "Looking for something?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, a sound scraped raw by dust and solitude. It was not a welcome, it was a challenge. Cora straightened her shoulders, a small, almost imperceptible adjustment that shifted the weight of her exhaustion. "I'm looking for Mr. Elias Thorne." "You found him," the man said, his gaze flickering from her to the boy and back again. He did not invite them closer. He did not offer a seat on the porch. He just stood there, a human wall between her and whatever slim hope this place represented. "The ranch isn't hiring. I'm not looking for a handout," Cora said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the afternoon stillness. She had rehearsed 100 different speeches on the long journey here, speeches filled with appeals and explanations. But looking at the man's closed-off face, she knew none of them would work. Honesty, raw and unvarnished, was the only currency she had left. "My name is Cora Halloran. This is my son, Leo. My husband died 6 months ago. The bank took our spread in the valley. I can cook, I can mend, I can keep books. I know cattle, and I know what it takes to run a place from before the sun is up until long after it's down. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. You give me and my boy a roof and board, and I will work harder than any man you've ever hired." Thorne's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He had heard variations of this before. Every drifter, every down-on-their-luck cowboy who passed through had a story. They were always the hardest worker, the most honest soul, right up until they drank their pay, stole a horse, or simply vanished in the night, leaving him one hand shorter and a little more cynical. He looked at the woman. She was thin, but not frail. There was a strength in the set of her jaw, a directness in her gaze that was unnerving. She wasn't pleading, she was stating terms. "I run a ranch, Mistress Halloran, not an orphanage," he said, the words deliberately cruel. He wanted to see her flinch, to see the desperation crack through the calm facade. If she broke, he could send her away with a clear conscience. Cora did not flinch. Her eyes, the color of moss in a deep forest, held his. "My son is not an orphan, and I am not a charity case. I am a capable woman at the end of her resources. There is a difference." It was the truth, stated so plainly and with such unadorned dignity that it silenced him. He looked at the boy, who stared back with wide, solemn eyes, not crying, not complaining, just watching. He looked at the woman's hands, clasped in front of her. They were not the soft hands of a town woman. They were chapped and reddened, the knuckles slightly swollen, the hands of a worker. As if on cue, a panicked shout erupted from the direction of the near pasture. "Boss! Boss, come quick! It's that new heifer, the one from the auction!" A young man, barely more than a boy himself, came running toward them, his face pale with alarm. "She's down. She's trying to calve, but it's wrong." Thorne cursed under his breath, the weariness on his face replaced by a sharp, anxious energy. He started toward the pasture at a half-run. "Jed, Silas, get over here!" Cora did not hesitate. "Leo, you stay right here by the bags. Do not move." She hitched up her skirts and followed Thorne, her stride long and purposeful. "This is ranch business, ma'am," Thorne grunted over his shoulder, not breaking stride. "You've got a breech berth by the sound of it," Cora said, easily keeping pace. You going to handle it with 2 old hands and a green boy, or do you want the help of someone who's pulled more calves than she can count? Thorne shot her a look of pure disbelief, but he didn't have time to argue. They reached the pasture fence and vaulted over it. The heifer was down on her side, her body heaving, her eyes wide with pain and terror. 2 other men, one older and wiry, the other thick-set and scowling, were standing by, looking helpless. It's backward, the young one, Billy said, wringing his hands. We tried to turn it, but she's too weak. Thorne knelt, his assessment swift and grim. The calf's hooves were presenting, but they were upside down, a fatal complication if not handled immediately. He began to roll up his sleeves, his face set in a grim mask of determination. You'll tear her up going in like that, Cora said, her voice calm and authoritative. She was already shrugging out of her dusty jacket. You need to push the calf back in, get it turned. You need smaller hands. Billy, get me a bucket of warm water and soap if you have it. Jed, hold her head, keep her calm. Silas, you and Mr. Thorne need to be ready to pull, but only when I say, and steady. The men stared at her, dumbfounded. It was Thorne who broke the spell. He looked from the dying heifer to the woman's determined face, at her hands that were already rolling up her own sleeves. He saw a flicker of the same grit he'd seen in his own mother decades ago. He made a decision. Do as she says, he barked. The surprise on the faces of Jed and Silas was plain, but they moved to obey. Billy scrambled off toward the cookhouse. Cora knelt in the dirt beside the suffering animal, murmuring to it in a low, soothing voice. When Billy returned with the water, she washed her hands and arms meticulously, a strange ritual of cleanliness in the middle of the dusty, chaotic scene. All right, she said, her voice low. This is going to hurt her. Hold her steady. She reached in, her arm disappearing to the shoulder inside the straining heifer. Her face was a mask of concentration, her brow furrowed. The animal groaned, its body shuddering, but Jed and Silas held it firm. Thorne watched, his skepticism warring with a nascent, grudging respect. He had seen seasoned veterinarians less certain in their movements. She was not guessing. She knew exactly what she was doing. The leg is caught on the pelvic bone, she said, her voice strained with effort. I need to push him back, just a little. Mr. Thorne, when I get him turned, you need to be ready. Minutes stretched into an eternity, measured in the heifer's ragged breaths and the woman's focused intensity. The sun beat down on them. Leo remained a small, still figure by the carpet bags, a silent witness to his mother's trial. Then, Cora's expression changed. Now, she said, her voice sharp. He's turned. Find the chain. Get it on his forelegs. Quick. Thorne and Silas moved with a practiced efficiency that had been absent moments before. They secured the calving chains. All right, Cora said, withdrawing her arm. On the next contraction, pull steady, downward angle, don't jerk. The heifer gave a great, shuddering push. Now, Cora commanded. Thorne and Silas leaned back, their muscles straining, pulling in a smooth, coordinated motion. There was a moment of resistance, and then a sudden wet slide. A small, slick body landed on the grass. For a terrifying second, it lay still. Cora was already there, scooping a handful of straw and clearing the calf's mouth and nostrils. She gave it a vigorous rub. It coughed, sputtered, and then, miraculously, lifted its head and let out a weak bleat. The mother cow, exhausted but alive, immediately turned her head, her tongue coming out to give her newborn its first bath. Silence descended on the small group, broken only by the mother's lowing and the calf's answering cry. Billy was grinning from ear to ear. Silas, the older hand, gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval. Jed just scowled, looking from the woman to the calf as if he couldn't decide which offended him more. Thorne stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Cora. She was covered in dirt and birth fluid, her face smudged, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked utterly spent, yet there was a light in her eyes, a fierce, triumphant glow. She had not just saved a calf. She had staked her claim. He walked over to the spot where Leo stood, still unmoving. The boy looked up at him, his large, dark eyes holding no fear, only a quiet watchfulness. Thorne then walked back to where Cora was getting to her feet, a little unsteadily. He cleared his throat. The old foreman's cabin is behind the cookhouse. It's not much, but it's dry. The bunkhouse eats at 6. If the food is edible, you can stay for the week. We'll see how it goes from there. It was not a thank you. It was not an apology. but it was an offer. Cora Halloran looked at the man who held the fate of her and her son in his calloused hands. She looked at the saved calf, already struggling to get to its wobbly legs. She looked back at her son, a small, lonely figure in the vast landscape. "The food will be edible," she said, and it was not a promise. It was a fact. Clear's throat. The foreman's cabin was, as Thorne had promised, not much. It was a single room, smelling of dust and disuse, with a rickety bed frame, a small table with one chair, and a cold, pot-bellied stove. But it had 4 walls, a roof that looked mostly intact, and a door that locked. To Cora, it felt like a palace. While Leo explored the single room with a solemn curiosity, touching the rough wood of the walls and peering out the single grimy window, Cora set to work. She unpacked their few belongings, 2 changes of clothes each, her husband's straight razor, a worn copy of Moby Dick, and a small tin of her mother's sewing needles. The last thing she pulled from her bag was a heavy cast-iron skillet, its surface black and smooth as polished obsidian. It had been her grandmother's. Holding it, she felt a grounding sense of continuity, a connection to the line of capable women from whom she descended. She left Leo with the book, knowing he couldn't read the words but would be captivated by the shapes of the letters, and went to inspect the cookhouse. It was worse than she had feared. The place was a monument to masculine neglect. A layer of grease coated every surface. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and rancid bacon fat, and the pantry was a chaotic jumble of half-empty sacks of flour, weevily beans, and a few sad, shriveled potatoes. It was a kitchen devoid of care, a place for mere sustenance, not nourishment. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over her. The task was monumental. But then she saw it, a small pot of herbs growing on the windowsill, struggling for light, but still alive. Someone, at some point, had tried. That was enough. She rolled up her sleeves and began. She did not start by cooking, she started by cleaning. With a bucket of hot water, a block of harsh lye soap, and a fierce, methodical energy, she waged war on the grime. She scrubbed the long trestle table until the pale wood grain showed through. She scoured the blackened pots and pans until they gleamed. She swept the floor, her movements economical and precise, without wasted motion. It was not a performance. It was an expression of her intrinsic nature, order from chaos. That was the first principle of survival. By late afternoon, the cookhouse was transformed. The air smelled of soap and lemon verbena from the herbs she'd crushed, not old grease. When she finally turned her attention to the evening meal, she found her options limited. There was salt pork, beans, and the aforementioned potatoes. But there was also a sack of cornmeal and a jar of molasses. By 6 o'clock, when the men trudged in from their day's work, they stopped dead in the doorway. The room was clean, the table was set, and the air was filled with a smell that none of them had encountered in this room for a very long time. The warm, comforting aroma of baking bread. On the table was a large pot of bean and salt pork stew, thicker and richer than they were used to. Beside it sat a platter of fluffy, golden-brown cornbread, still steaming from the oven. There was a pot of strong, hot coffee that tasted like coffee, not boiled dirt. The men shuffled in, uncertain. Billy, the young hand, looked around with wide, appreciative eyes. Silas, the old-timer, took his seat and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Jed, the resistor, grumbled under his breath but sat down heavily, his hunger overriding his suspicion. Elias Thorne was the last to enter. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the clean room, the simple but wholesome food. He saw Cora moving from the stove to the table, her face flushed from the heat, placing a small jar of wild berry jam she'd found in the back of the pantry on the table. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost beautiful. He saw his men, for the first time in months, sitting down to a meal that felt like a meal, not just fuel. He saw his son's book, placed neatly on a small shelf she had cleared, a silent testament to a life beyond mere work. From Thorne's perspective, the ranch had been running on a kind of stubborn momentum, the lingering energy of his father's ambition. He had been managing its decline, not building its future. For years, he had felt like a man trying to plug a dozen leaks in a sinking boat with only his own 2 hands. The arrival of this woman and her silent child felt less like another leak and more like a strange, unexpected current, pushing his foundering vessel in a new direction. He was not a man given to hope, but as he sat down and a plate of hot stew was placed before him, he felt something dangerously close to it. Cora did not sit with them. She served them, then took a plate for herself and Leo back to their small cabin. She knew her place was not yet at that table. Her presence was provisional, her acceptance not yet earned. As she ate, listening to the low murmur of the men's voices from the cookhouse, she looked at Leo. He was meticulously arranging crumbs from his cornbread into patterns on the table. He hadn't spoken a word since his father's funeral. The doctor in their old town had said it was a kind of shock, that his voice would return when he felt safe. Cora reached out and smoothed his hair. "We'll be safe here, Leo," she whispered. It was a promise she had no right to make, but one she would move heaven and earth to keep. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by work and weather. Cora rose before the sun, lighting the lamps in the cookhouse and starting the coffee. Her days were a blur of cooking, baking, mending, and cleaning. She turned the neglected vegetable garden behind the cabin into a productive patch, coaxing lettuce and radishes from the tired soil. She discovered a flock of scrawny chickens roosting in the rafters of the barn and soon had them laying in the nesting boxes she built, providing fresh eggs for breakfast. She took the men's torn shirts and worn-out trousers and, with her mother's needles, patched and reinforced them until they were stronger than before. Her work was a quiet, constant force, a tide of competence that slowly began to turn the ranch. The men were eating better than they had in years. They were healthier, their moods improved. Fights over stale biscuits and weak coffee were replaced by quiet requests for a second helping of her apple cobbler, made from a trio of gnarled, forgotten apple trees she had found near the creek. Billy, the young hand, was her first and most open ally. He was a good-hearted boy, eager to please and starved for a bit of maternal kindness. He would bring her wildflowers for the table and linger after meals, telling her stories about the horses. He was especially kind to Leo, often whittling small animals for him out of scraps of wood. One evening, he presented the boy with a perfectly carved horse, its tiny legs caught in mid-gallop. Leo took the horse, his small fingers tracing its smooth lines, and for the first time in months, a flicker of a smile touched his lips. Cora felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to tears. Silas, the quiet observer, showed his approval in his own way. He was a man of few words, a veteran of a dozen cattle drives and 3 hard winters on this very ranch. His praise was not given in speech but in action. He began leaving a stack of freshly split firewood by her cabin door each morning. One afternoon, he found her struggling to sharpen a dull knife on a worn-out stone and returned an hour later with a proper whetstone from his own kit, showing her how to draw the blade across it in a precise, fluid motion until it was sharp enough to shave with. It was a transfer of knowledge, a sign of respect. Jed, however, remained the rock against which the tide of her influence seemed to break. He saw her competence not as a blessing, but as a threat. He was a man comfortable in the well-worn grooves of dysfunction. Cora's improvements were a constant, silent rebuke to his own long-standing mediocrity. He had been the one who did the ordering, the one who managed the cookhouse in his own haphazard way. Her efficiency exposed his laziness. His resistance was a campaign of 1,000 small cuts. He complained that the bread was too soft, that the stew needed more salt, that she was wasting time in the garden when she should be darning his socks. He spoke just loud enough for her to hear, his words laced with a sour resentment. "Got notions, this one," he'd mutter to the other hands. "Thinks she's running the place." Cora ignored him, her focus absolute. She had dealt with men like Jed her whole life. Men who confused tradition with stagnation. Men whose pride was so brittle it shattered at the first sign of a woman's capability. Arguing with him would be like wrestling with a pig in mud. She would only get dirty, and he would enjoy it. The confrontation, when it came, was not of her choosing. It was a week after her probationary period had ended, a deadline that had passed without comment from Thorne. She was serving dinner, a rich beef stew made with a tough cut of meat she had slow-cooked for hours until it was meltingly tender. The men were eating with relish, all except Jed. He pushed his bowl away after a single bite. "Can't eat this," he announced to the table. "Woman's trying to poison us with fancy cooking. What was wrong with the way things were?" The room fell silent. Billy looked down at his plate, embarrassed. Silas stopped chewing, his eyes fixed on Jed. Cora, who was standing by the stove with a heavy cast-iron skillet in her hand, which she had just been cleaning, did not turn around immediately. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "There is nothing fancy about it, Jed," she said, her voice even and calm. She turned to face him, the skillet held loosely at her side. It was not a threat, but it had weight. It's beef, potatoes, and carrots. The same things you've been eating for years. The only difference is I cooked it long enough to make it edible. Jed's face flushed a dark, mottled red. It's her notions I'm talking about. Coming in here, changing everything. We had a system. Your system, Cora said, her voice dropping, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. Involved weevils in the flour and green mold on the bacon. Your system was why the supply order for this month was never placed. The stew has potatoes and carrots because the last of the beans ran out yesterday and the flour sack is empty. The flour you were supposed to order 2 weeks ago. It was a stunning, direct hit. A statement of unassailable fact that laid his negligence bare for all to see. Jed opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no defense. Into this tense tableau walked Elias Thorne. He had been in the barn, checking on the mended fence line, and had been drawn by the sudden silence from the cookhouse. He took in the scene at a glance, Jed's furious, humiliated face, Billy's discomfort, Silas's unreadable expression, and Cora, standing resolute, the heavy skillet a dark period at the end of her sentence. Is there a problem here? Thorne asked, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. Jed, seeing his employer, scrambled for a defense. She's disrespectful, boss, questioning my work. Thorne's gray eyes moved from Jed to Cora. He looked at the clean room, the wholesome food on the table, and he looked at the woman who had brought this order to his chaotic world. He had seen the empty flour sacks himself that afternoon. He had noticed the absence of beans. He walked over to the table and picked up Jed's abandoned bowl of stew. He took a spoonful. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. Then he looked at Jed, his eyes cold as a winter morning. The woman is right, Jed, Thorne said, his voice flat and final. The stew is fine. Your work, on the other hand, is not. You'll ride into town first thing in the morning. You won't come back without every item on the list she gives you. He turned to Cora. Mistress Halloran, you'll give Jed a new supply list, and from now on, you will be in charge of the pantry and all ordering. Your pay will be adjusted accordingly. He placed the bowl back on the table. And Jed, he added, without raising his voice, you will show Mistress Halloran the respect her position now warrants. Is that clear? Jed stared at his plate, his face a mask of sullen defeat. Clear, boss, he mumbled. The incident marked a definitive shift. Cora was no longer just the cook. She was an acknowledged authority, her position solidified not by her own assertion, but by the public validation of the owner. She had won the internal battle. But as she watched Jed ride out the next morning, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She felt no triumph, only a grim understanding that survival on this ranch involved more than just hard work. It required navigating the treacherous currents of human pride, a landscape even more dangerous than the high Montana plains. With her authority over the domestic operations of the ranch solidified, Cora's responsibilities expanded. Thorne, without any formal discussion, began to hand her tasks that fell far outside the purview of a cook. It began with the books. The ranch's ledgers were a chaotic mess, a history of transactions recorded on scraps of paper, in the margins of almanacs, and on the backs of old receipts, all stuffed into a dusty wooden box. See if you can make sense of this, Thorne had said, placing the box on the cookhouse table with a thud. My father had a system. I never quite figured it out. For Cora, the chaotic ledgers were a language she understood. Her own father had taught her bookkeeping, insisting it was as important as knowing how to brand a calf or mend a fence. Numbers don't lie, Cora, he used to say. They just tell a story. You just have to learn how to read it. So, night after night, by the light of a kerosene lamp in her small cabin, after Leo was asleep, Cora worked. She painstakingly transcribed the disparate notes into a new, clean ledger Thorne had bought for her in town. She created columns for income and expenditures, for livestock tallies and feed costs. Slowly, methodically, a clear picture of the Thorne Ranch's financial health began to emerge. It was not a pretty picture. The ranch was bleeding money, a slow, steady hemorrhage from a dozen small wounds. Supplies were being bought at inflated prices from the mercantile in town. The price Thorne was getting for his cattle at auction was consistently lower than the going rate. And there was one name that appeared over and over again, a recurring character in the story of the ranch's decline, Marcus Sterling. Sterling was their nearest neighbor, a man whose own ranch was expanding, seemingly by the day. According to the ledgers, Thorne paid Sterling a hefty fee each year for grazing rights on a piece of land called the North Meadow and for access to Sage Creek, which cut through Sterling's property. The fees had increased every year for the past 5 years, a fact Thorne had accepted with a resentful resignation. "Man's got me over a barrel," he'd grumbled to Cora. "My father made that deal with his father, a handshake deal. Now the son is making me pay for it in blood." Cora, however, was not one for handshake deals or inherited grievances. She was a woman of facts and figures. Something about the Sterling arrangement felt wrong. It was too neat, too costly. One rainy afternoon, when the men were confined to the barn mending harnesses, she retrieved the ranch's deed from the tin box where Thorne kept his important papers. It was a brittle, yellowed document, written in the elegant looping script of a bygone era. She spread it out on the table, her finger tracing the legal description of the property boundaries. She cross-referenced the language with an old survey map she had found folded inside the deed. And then she saw it. It was a single, almost overlooked clause in the original founding document of the Thorne Ranch, a covenant attached to the sale of the neighboring property to Sterling's grandfather decades ago. The clause granted the Thorne Ranch perpetual and irrevocable access to the waters of Sage Creek, from its headwaters to the point at which it crosses the southern boundary, for the purpose of watering livestock, without fee or impediment. The grazing rights for the North Meadow were a separate, renewable lease, but the water rights were permanent. They were part of the land itself. For 50 years, the Sterlings had honored the agreement. But Marcus Sterling, it seemed, was either ignorant of the clause or was banking on the fact that Elias Thorne was. He was charging Thorne for something that already belonged to him. Cora felt a cold, clear anger settle in her stomach. This was not just a bad business deal, it was a profound betrayal, a theft perpetrated not with a gun, but with a pen and a lie of omission. She did not immediately run to Thorne with her discovery. Accusation was not the same as proof. She spent the next 2 days meticulously preparing her case. She made a clean copy of the relevant passage from the deed. She drew a simple map showing the creek's path in relation to the two ranches. She tallied the total amount of money Thorne had paid Sterling for water access over the last 5 years. The number was staggering. It was enough to have bought a new bull, to have fixed the barn roof, to have hired 2 more hands. It was the lifeblood of the ranch, siphoned off year after year. She waited for the right moment. It came one evening after dinner. The men had dispersed, and Thorne was sitting at the clean trestle table, nursing a cup of coffee, a rare moment of stillness in his day. He looked tired, the lines on his face etched deeper by the setting sun slanting through the window. "Mr. Thorne," Cora began, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to show you something." She laid the papers out on the table before him, the new ledger, the copy of the deed's clause, the hand-drawn map, the tally of payments. She did not interpret or accuse. She simply presented the facts, explaining them in a calm, logical progression. Thorne listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He picked up the copy of the deed, his rough fingers tracing the words his own grandfather had signed. He looked at the map, his eyes following the blue line she had drawn to represent the creek. He stared at the final tally of the money he had paid Sterling, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. When she was finished, he sat back, the chair groaning under his weight. He looked not at the papers, but at her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide with a raw, complex emotion, anger, humiliation, and a dawning, astonished respect. "My own father," he said, his voice a low rasp. "My father signed that paper, and I never thought to look. I just kept paying." He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. "That thieving son of a—" He didn't finish the sentence. He stood up and paced the length of the cookhouse, his boots echoing on the clean floorboards. He was a man waking from a long, costly sleep. The ranch's decline, which he had attributed to bad luck and hard times, was suddenly reframed. It was not just misfortune, it was theft. From Thorne's perspective, Cora Halloran had ceased to be a mere employee long ago. She had become an advisor, a confidant, a force of nature that was reshaping his world. But this was different. This was not about cooking or cleaning or even bookkeeping. This was about the heart of the ranch itself, its history, its rights, its very survival. She had seen a truth he had been blind to his entire life. She had handed him a weapon, not of iron, but of ink and paper, and with it, a chance to fight back. He stopped pacing and stood before her. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, a transfer of trust so profound it was almost tangible. He was no longer just the boss. He was asking for her counsel. "I think," Cora said, choosing her words carefully, "that you should ride over to Marcus Sterling's ranch tomorrow. I think you should take this deed with you, and I think you should inform him that, effective immediately, you will no longer be paying for your own water." She paused. "And then I think you should present him with a bill for the last 5 years of his theft." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Elias Thorne's face. It was the first time Cora had ever seen him smile. It was not a pleasant sight, but it was a powerful one. It was the smile of a man who had just been reminded how to fight. "Mistress Halloran," he said, the formal title now laced with a deep, newfound respect. "I believe that is the best damn advice I've received in 20 years. The next morning, Thorne rode out, not with the slumped shoulders of a man resigned to his fate, but with the straight-backed posture of a man on a mission. He carried the deed in his saddlebag. The confrontation with Marcus Sterling was not something Cora would witness, but its repercussions would soon shake the very foundations of their fragile peace. The story of the numbers had been told. A new, more dangerous story was about to begin. The days following Thorne's confrontation with Marcus Sterling were deceptively quiet. Thorne had returned late that afternoon, his face set like granite. He offered no details of the meeting, but the grim satisfaction in his eyes told Cora enough. The theft had been named. The payments had stopped. But a man like Sterling, a man whose greed was woven into the fabric of his character, would not accept such a defeat gracefully. His power was built on the perception of strength and the exploitation of weakness. Thorne, armed with Cora's discovery, had shown he was no longer weak. Sterling's response was inevitable. Only the form it would take was unknown. A chill began to creep into the air, a harbinger of the coming winter. The aspens in the high country turned a brilliant, trembling gold. The men worked with a new urgency, mending fences, reinforcing the barn, and bringing the cattle down from the summer pastures. A sense of foreboding hung over the ranch, as palpable as the morning frost. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A section of fence along the southern boundary, far from the disputed creek, was cut in the night. A dozen head of cattle wandered off before Billy discovered the break at dawn. It took 2 days of hard riding to round them all up. Thorne inspected the cut wires himself. "This wasn't no stray animal," he declared, his voice tight with fury. "This was done with cutters, clean." He stared off in the direction of Sterling's ranch, his eyes narrowed. It was a message, an escalation. A week later, Thorne rode into town for supplies and was met with a cold reception at the Mercantile. The proprietor, a man who had always been overly friendly, was suddenly curt and evasive. Prices had gone up, he claimed. Credit was no longer possible. Thorne knew Sterling's influence reached deep into the town's commercial life. This was the second front of the war, economic isolation. The final piece of the crisis fell into place on a gray, overcast afternoon. A rider from a neighboring ranch to the east stopped by with a warning. "There's a storm coming, Elias," he said, his face grim. "A bad one. My grandfather used to say the sky gets this color, this flat, dead gray, right before a blizzard that'll bury a man standing." Thorne thanked him and stared at the bruised-looking sky. The air had gone still and heavy, the temperature dropping with alarming speed. A major blizzard was the worst possible scenario. The bulk of the herd was still in the West Basin, a large pasture miles from the relative safety of the main barn. They needed to be moved, and quickly. "Jed, Billy, saddle up!" Thorne yelled, his voice sharp with command. "We're bringing the herd in, now!" But as he turned to head for the stables, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He staggered, putting a hand out to brace himself against a fence post. His face was unnaturally pale, and a sheen of cold sweat covered his forehead. Cora, who had come out of the cookhouse to see what the shouting was about, rushed to his side. "Mr. Thorne, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he gritted out, but the words were belied by the way he swayed on his feet. He had been pushing himself too hard, the stress of the conflict with Sterling and the endless work of the ranch taking their toll. A fever he'd been fighting for 2 days had finally broken through his stubborn resistance. "You are not fine," Cora stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She put a hand on his forehead. It was burning. "You have a fever. You're in no condition to ride into a storm." "The cattle," he protested, his voice weak. "The cattle will be handled." Cora said, her own resolve hardening as his wavered. She helped him lean against the fence. Jed, Billy, help me get him inside. The two hands, their faces etched with worry, helped their boss into the main house. Thorne, for the first time since Cora had met him, looked utterly defeated, his body betraying him at the worst possible moment. He was trapped, powerless to act, a general struck down on the eve of battle. The power vacuum he left was immediate and absolute. Jed, without Thorne's authority to direct him, was a study in panicked indecision. We can't go out there without the boss, he stammered. It's a fool's errand. We should just hunker down and hope for the best. Hope is not a strategy, a quiet voice said. All eyes turned to Cora. She stood in the doorway of the great house, her sleeves rolled up, her expression calm and determined. The wind was beginning to pick up, whipping stray strands of hair around her face. The first snowflakes, small and hard as pellets of sand, were beginning to fall. If we leave that herd in the basin, they'll drift with the storm and pile up against the fences or freeze where they stand, she said, her voice cutting through Jed's panicked whining. We lose them. We lose this ranch. It's that simple. This was the crisis in its purest form. The external threat, the blizzard, was here. The human threat, Marcus Sterling, had already weakened them with his campaign of sabotage and isolation. And the one man who was supposed to lead them was incapacitated. The ranch was adrift, its fate hanging in the balance, waiting for a hand to take the tiller. Cora Halloran looked at the frightened faces of the men, at the darkening sky, and at the small cabin where her son was waiting. She had not come this far to watch it all be swept away by a storm, natural or man-made. She had come here to build a home, and she would not let it fall. Cora took a deep breath, the frigid air searing her lungs. In that moment, she was not a cook, not a housekeeper, not a widow. She was the sum of all her experiences, the daughter of a rancher, the wife of a cattleman, a survivor. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for a consensus. She took charge. Billy, she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised them all, herself included. Saddle my mare and the two strongest pack horses. Load them with the oilcloth tarps from the shed, all the rope you can find, and the lanterns. Fill the lanterns with oil before you go. Billy, who had been looking lost, snapped to attention as if a general had given the order. Yes, ma'am, he said, and sprinted towards the barn, his fear replaced by the simple relief of having a clear task. Jed, Cora said, turning to the older hand. Jed's face was a mixture of resentment and fear. You can't order me around, he began to bluster. I'm not ordering you, Cora said, her gaze steady and cold. I'm giving you a choice. You can stay here, keep the fires lit, and look after Mr. Thorne, or you can get in the way. But if you get in the way, you will answer to me when this is over. What's it to be? From the porch of the main house, another figure emerged, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. It was Silas. He had been watching the entire exchange, his old, wise eyes moving from the sky to Cora. He walked over to the woodpile, picked up an axe, and with a single, powerful swing, split a log cleanly in two. The boy and I will ride with you, ma'am, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He did not look at Jed. He looked at Cora. It was the ultimate vote of confidence, a transfer of allegiance from the old boss to the new, temporary one. You'll need another experienced hand out there. Jed can mind the house. The shame of it was a physical blow to Jed. To be relegated to house-minding while the old man and the boy rode into a blizzard with a woman was the ultimate insult to his pride. He flushed, mumbled something incoherent, and stomped off towards the main house, his relevance in the coming struggle reduced to zero. Thank you, Silas, Cora said with a grateful nod. Saddle your horse. We leave in 10 minutes. She turned and went to her own cabin. Leo was at the window, his small hand pressed against the cold glass, watching the snow begin to fall in earnest. She knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. Leo, I have to go out for a little while, she said softly. Jed will be in the main house with Mr. Thorne. There is food on the table and wood for the stove. You are to stay inside and be a brave boy for me. Can you do that? He looked at her, his eyes wide with a fear he couldn't articulate. He didn't want her to go, but he nodded, a single jerky motion. He understood duty. He had seen it in her every day since they arrived. Cora hugged him tightly. I will be back, she whispered into his hair, a promise that felt as fragile as a snowflake. When she emerged, Billy and Silas were waiting, the horses saddled and ready, their breath pluming in the freezing air. The world had been reduced to a swirl of gray and white, the wind howling like a hungry wolf. "Where are we taking them?" Billy shouted over the gale. "The main barn is too far to drive them in this." "We're not going to the barn," Cora yelled back. "We're going to the place Sterling doesn't know about." "Silas, you know the old Stone Slide Canyon south of the West Basin? The one that's all boxed in?" Silas's eyes lit with understanding. It was a geological freak, a deep, narrow canyon with high rock walls, created by a prehistoric rockslide. It was sheltered from the wind and almost impossible to find unless you knew it was there. It was a natural corral. "Can we get the herd there from the west?" Cora pressed. "It's a hard ride, but it can be done," Silas confirmed. "The entrance is narrow. We can hold them there." "That's our plan," Cora declared. "We find them, we push them south, and we hold them in the canyon until this breaks." It was an unconventional plan, a gamble based on intimate knowledge of the land, the very thing Sterling, with all his money and influence, lacked. This was Cora's intellectual solution, born of observation and conversations with Silas, of studying the old maps, of paying attention. They rode out into the teeth of the storm, three small figures against the overwhelming power of nature. The world dissolved into a blinding, disorienting whiteness. The snow stung their faces, and the wind threatened to tear them from their saddles. They navigated by instinct and Silas's encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain, following the faint lines of ridges and creeks that were rapidly disappearing under a blanket of white. They found the herd huddled together for warmth on the leeward side of a small hill, already coated in snow, their lowing fearful and distressed. As they drew closer, Billy pointed to the far side of the pasture. "The fence!" he shouted. "It's down!" A long section of the fence that bordered Sterling's property was not just broken but systematically cut, the posts knocked over. It was Sterling's final, most malevolent act of sabotage. He hadn't just been hoping the storm would kill Thorne's cattle. He had been actively trying to drive them out onto the open range, where they would scatter and freeze, or worse, wander onto his own property, where he could claim them as strays. He had used the cover of the storm to try and steal the entire herd. Seeing the cut fence filled Cora not with fear, but with a righteous fury. The battle was no longer just against the snow. It was against the malice of a greedy man. "Forget the fence," Cora commanded. "We need to turn them, now, before they scatter." For the next few hours, they engaged in a brutal, exhausting ballet of horsemanship. Cora, Billy, and Silas became a single, determined unit, a tiny trio of will against the chaos. They rode the edges of the herd, their voices hoarse from shouting, using their horses to nudge and guide the terrified, reluctant cattle. It was a battle of inches, of preventing a small breakaway from turning into a full-blown stampede. Cora was everywhere, a whirlwind of focused energy. Her mare, sensing the urgency, responded to her every command, moving with a grace that belied the treacherous footing. She was no longer Cora Halloran, the widow, the cook. She was a cattlewoman in her element, her competence a burning light in the heart of the storm. Slowly, painfully, they began to push the massive animals south, away from the broken fence and towards the promise of shelter. The entrance to the box canyon was a narrow slit in a rock face, barely visible in the swirling snow. One by one, they forced the lead cows through the opening. The rest, sensing the shelter from the wind within, followed. As the last of the herd passed into the relative calm of the canyon, the three riders slumped in their saddles, their energy utterly spent. They had done it. They had saved the heart of the ranch. Using the ropes and tops, they fashioned a crude but effective barrier across the narrow entrance, then built a small sheltered fire just inside the canyon mouth. The storm raged outside, but within the stone walls, the wind was a distant moan, the snow falling gently. The cattle, exhausted but safe, settled in with low groans of contentment. Billy looked at Cora, his young face streaked with dirt and melting snow, his eyes shining with awe. "We did it," he breathed. "You did it." Cora looked at the herd, her herd, safe. She looked at the fire, a small beacon of warmth and defiance against the storm and the darkness. The victory was not one of force, but of intelligence, of resilience, of knowing the land better than the man who sought to steal it. Marcus Sterling, in his warm house, was likely counting his victory, assuming the blizzard was doing his dirty work. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the land, and he had fatally underestimated the woman who had come to call it home. The storm would eventually break, and when it did, the truth of what had happened here, the cut fence, the saved herd, would be undeniable. Sterling's defeat would be moral and social, a quiet ruin built from his own greed. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights. In the sheltered confines of the Box Canyon, Cora, Billy, and Silas rationed the small amount of jerky and hardtack they had brought, melting snow for water and taking turns keeping watch. The world was reduced to the stone walls of the canyon, the lowing of the cattle, and the hiss of the endless snow. It was a time outside of time, a period of quiet, shared survival after the frantic climax of the rescue. When the storm finally broke, it was as if a curtain had been lifted. The sun emerged, dazzlingly bright, reflecting off a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the canyon walls. The ride back to the ranch was slow and arduous, their horses struggling through deep drifts. As they crested the final ridge and the ranch buildings came into view, they saw a group of riders gathered in the yard. It was their other neighbors, drawn by the unwritten code of the West that demanded communities check on each other after a major storm. And standing among them, looking hale and hearty, was Marcus Sterling. He was holding a cup of coffee, a look of faux concern on his face as he spoke to Jed. When he saw the 3 figures riding down from the hills, his expression faltered. When he saw the healthy, living herd of cattle trailing behind them, his face went slack with disbelief. This was not the outcome he had envisioned. Cora rode directly into the center of the yard, her face grim, her clothes still damp. She slid from her mare, every muscle in her body aching. She ignored Sterling completely. Her eyes were only for the main house. The door opened, and Elias Thorne stepped out onto the porch, leaning heavily on a carved stick. He was pale and gaunt, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on her. "The herd is safe," Cora announced, her voice carrying in the crisp, clean air. "All of it. We held them in the Stone Slide Canyon." She then turned her gaze, cold and sharp as an icicle, directly on Marcus Sterling. "We found the fence you cut, Marcus. The one you cut to drive them out into the storm." A collective gasp went through the assembled ranchers. The accusation was direct, public, and utterly damning. Sterling's face turned a blotchy red. "That's a lie," he sputtered. "A desperate accusation from a hired woman." "Is it?" Thorne's voice cut through the tension. He limped down the porch steps, his gaze never leaving Sterling's. "Because my hand, Billy, and my oldest friend Silas were with her. They saw it too. And I imagine the tracks your men left leading from your land to my fence line are still there, clear as day under this fresh snow. Shall we all ride out and have a look, Marcus?" The silence that followed was Sterling's ruin. Every man there knew the terrain. They knew the impossibility of Thorne's weakened crew saving a herd in a blizzard without extraordinary measures. They knew the story of the water rights had been circulating. And now, they looked at Sterling's panicked face and Cora's exhausted, resolute one, and they knew the truth. No one moved to defend Sterling. His neighbors simply turned their backs on him, a quiet, collective shunning more powerful than any court of law. His power, built on bluster and intimidation, evaporated in the cold morning sun. Defeated, he mounted his horse and rode away, not just from the Thorne Ranch, but from the community he had tried to manipulate. He was a ghost now, a man without honor. Thorne walked over to Cora, ignoring the other men. He stopped in front of her, his eyes taking in her worn-out face, the strength that seemed to radiate from her very bones. He had spent 2 feverish days and nights in a helpless agony of worry, listening to the storm, convinced he was about to lose everything. He had lain there, powerless, while this woman, this impossible woman, had gone out and saved it all. He reached out and with a gesture of uncharacteristic tenderness, brushed a stray piece of straw from her hair. "I hired a cook," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. The other ranchers began to discreetly move away, giving them their space. "I hired a woman to make meals and mend shirts." He looked around at his ranch, at the saved herd, at the solid-looking buildings that suddenly seemed to stand a little straighter. "What I got," he continued, his gaze returning to her face, was the one person who knew what this place needed, what I needed. The formality of their previous interactions fell away, consumed by the fire of the crisis they had weathered. This was no longer a conversation between an employer and an employee. "Cora," he said, using her first name for the first time, "this is more than your job. This is your home now, if you'll have it." He hesitated, the next words costing him more than any business deal he had ever made. "If you'll have me, not as a boss, as a partner, in all of it." It was a proposal, not of marriage in that moment, but of something just as binding, a shared future, a merging of fates, a formal acknowledgement that his ranch was no longer his alone. It was theirs. Cora looked at this weary, stubborn, honorable man. She looked at the home her son was sleeping in. She thought of the skillet, the symbol of her heritage, hanging by the stove. She had come here seeking only survival. She had found something infinitely more precious. She had found a place to belong. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Yes." A few months later, the last of the snow had melted, feeding the green grass that carpeted the valley. The Thorn Ranch was alive. The barn had a new roof, the fences were taut and strong, and 2 new hands, hired for their character as much as their skill, were at work in the fields. The air of decline was gone, replaced by a quiet, bustling prosperity. Inside the cookhouse, the late afternoon sun streamed through a clean window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Elias Thorne sat at the long trestle table, not with his ledgers, but with a small, intricately carved wooden horse in his hands, smoothing a rough edge with his knife. A slight limp was the only reminder of the winter's trials. Across from him, Cora worked a piece of dough on the floured tabletop, her movements rhythmic and sure. The scent of yeast and cinnamon filled the warm kitchen. A small sound from the doorway made them both look up. Leo stood there, holding the new calf, the one his mother had saved on the day of their arrival, by a short rope. The calf was now a sturdy, inquisitive yearling. Leo, who had started speaking again in whispers a week after the blizzard, then in full sentences, looked from Elias to his mother, a proud smile on his face. "He followed me again," Leo announced, his voice clear and bright. Elias chuckled, a warm, easy sound that was no longer a rarity in this house. "Well, I suppose you'll have to lead him back again, little man." Cora watched them, her heart full. She watched the man who was becoming a father to her son. She watched the boy who had found his voice in the safety of these walls. She looked at her own hands, covered in flour, creating nourishment and warmth. The Thorn Ranch had been a place of hard lines, hard luck, and a long, weary solitude. It had been waiting a lifetime, not for a savior or a soldier, but for the one thing it had never truly had. It had been waiting for the woman who would finally make it a home.